Okay, board members, welcome back. Let's make sure we have a quorum. Who do we need to?
Who's online?
Do we have members Green, Brenton, Booth, and Vice Chair Wood with us still, I believe. So, board members, just so your awareness, we don't want to call another special meeting. So we are going to make sure that we get as through our agenda items, and then we will go back to agenda item 5, and take care of what we can before we close down this meeting. So we are going to move to agenda item 6, readiness, improvement, success, empowerment. And who do we have? Sydney and Teresa. Is that right? So please.
Thank you. We're excited to come to you today to present the RISE ELA cut score recommendations from the committee that has been put in place from teachers across the state. And we're going to talk through a little bit of that process, what the outcomes of their recommended cuts would be, and then open it up for questions. So, I forgot to introduce myself. Sydney McCarty, I'm the Director of Assessment and Accountability. And with me,
I'm Teresa
yeah.
I'm Teresa McIntyre, the Assessment Development Coordinator.
So the process and what's required for our RISE assessments are spelled out in R277404 and in State Code 53E4303. So those are the requirements for administering assessments in RISE. Some of the key components of that rule and code are that the assessment is a computer adaptive assessment and that it's aligned to our Utah state standards. So because on our next slide, you'll see the process that the new ELA standards were approved in April of 2023. And so we went through the process of updating our blueprints to align to those new ELA standards. And part of the process with updating our blueprints was to review what was currently in our item bank and then move forward with new development for items that would be aligned to our new ELA standards, as well as remove items that are no longer aligned to our standards. So part of that discussion was that we wanted to move forward with implementing some cluster assessments in our language arts tests. So most of our items are passage-based. They have an informative or a literature passage and then questions that are aligned to specific standards with those passages. We also included in the blueprints that each student would get one cluster, and the cluster is still a passage-based item, but it is helping the students walk through a specific content or specific standard from an easier starting point and walking them through step by step to get to a more complex ending to that issue or question. So the blueprints were updated to include one cluster for each student, as well as the other reading informational or reading literature passage-based questions. Part of the changes for the new ELA assessments in RISE were due to some changes with standards. So because in the past we had assessed language standards, and those in the new ELA standards were looped in with writing, those are being assessed on our writing assessments, which are in 5th and 8th grade on RISE. And so they're no longer part of the overall ELA assessment. So those questions were removed from the main blueprints. And the other things that were removed were any questions that were aligned to speaking and listening standards. That was because while we still have speaking and listening standards in all grades, not all of the grades had specific listening questions, listening standards to be assessed. And so after reviewing with our policy advisors and other educators, of do we want to include listening on only some grades and not other grades, the consensus was to have consistency among the grades and what we were assessing. So we were no longer assessing speaking listening standards in addition to those language standards. So those are some of the changes to the ELA assessment.
Our standard setting was held on August 3rd through 5th, and we had 3 different groups of educators from LEAs across the state, including both district and charter schools. And the teachers started by reviewing the performance level descriptors, which were written by a group of educators in September of 24, and it outlines the skills and knowledge that students need to demonstrate at each proficiency level for each standard. And then, as part of our standard setting process, the educators reviewed actual items from the RISE assessment that were ordered by difficulty based on the actual percent of students that got the item correct in the spring. Then teachers were asked to consider the proficiency levels on the performance level descriptors document and the difficulty of the items themselves to determine where those proficiency cut scores should be. After individually reviewing all of the items, they discussed as a group and adjusted as needed. So they started with grades 4, 6, and 8, and then went through the same process for grades 3, 5, and 7, with the goal of ensuring that as much as possible, the cut scores were in alignment with each other across grades. So this chart provides the percent of students that would be at each proficiency level by grade. I'll just give you a minute to take a look at it. Okay. Go to the next one. Yes.
We have a question. Member Kelly, hit your mic.
So I probably should have just done this, but if I add up all those numbers going across line 3, they would add up to 100%. And so level 3, 26.59, level 4, 18.8%. So 18.8% were level 4. If you were level 4, that's not included in level 3, right? Just, okay, clarify that.
So this slide shows the percent of students that would be proficient and highly proficient. So this is adding up that level 3 and level 4 on this slide. At each grade level, compared to the percent of students that were proficient and highly proficient in 2024 and 2023. So these percentages have not taken into consideration any of the USBE data rules being applied. So the final percentages would be slightly different than what is here on the screen. This is just looking at the raw data.
You have a question from Member Bogus?
So I just want to clarify that I heard you say this right. If the new cut scores are applied, this would be the proficiency levels in previous years.
No, those are the proficiency levels as they currently exist. The 2025 column would be the new cut scores with the new proficiency levels. So the 2024 and 2023 are what they actually were in 2024 and 2023.
So
with
we're
our
applying,
with the current cut scores. The
May I follow
2025 would be the new ones.
so we're applying a new cut score to an already taken test?
Yes.
So may I respond? So Sydney McCarty, Director of Assessment and Accountability. Yeah, so the process has been, we had a different blueprint up through from 2014 until 2024. We had the same blueprint where we assessed the same things. In 2014, we brought the recommendations from the educators of where those cut scores should be. So we've had those consistent the last 10 years. With the new ELA standards comes a new blueprint. So we're measuring new standards, so we need to set new cuts of where those should be. So these 24 and 23 data points are just supplied for information purposes to see from our previous standards and previous cuts, that's how many students were proficient and above proficient. And then with the recommendation from the committee of where the cuts would be applied starting in 2025, that would be how many students are proficient or above proficient starting in 25 and moving forward.
Okay, thank you.
Vice Chair Bollinger, and then Member Carey.
Thank you, Chair. I have a couple of questions, if I may, to and direct them to staff. So these are the percentages. Do we have an actual cut score number that you can share with us, and what that compares to from previous years? What was decided on? Because my understanding is we were supposed to approve a cut score, but I only see percentages, not an actual score.
Yeah, so thank you for that question. We have two different options of what the cut scores could be, and they were presented to our technical advisory committee a week or two ago. One of the recommendations for the cut scores, for the actual numbers, so the range of numbers, was similar to what our current numbers are on RISE ELA. And part of our conversation, so they start in like the 400s, which is similar to where they are currently for that scale score and where those cuts should be, versus a different scale that would be on like a 1500 scale score range. The conversation that we're having right now with our technical advisors is trying to determine of those numbers which ones would be a better scale to go on. The conversation about if we have a similar scale, like in the 400 ranges, would that invite comparisons to previous cut scores? And people would say, well, last year I got a 596 and this year I got a 492, and try to make comparisons between one test and the other. And there are different blueprints, different standards being assessed, including, like I mentioned, the removal of language standards and listening and speaking standards. And so we're trying to decide if those actual cut scores being on a scale of like a 1500 scale would help to not have the comparison from one test to the other test.
Yeah, just one more follow-up. So when we're looking at data, it's very nuanced and it has lots of different meanings. And I think sometimes the public doesn't quite understand what these percentages are saying. So I've heard some people say, oh, only 42% of our students can read because of these scores. Can you speak to what a performance level descriptor actually means and what this in context means as far as what our students can and cannot do?
The proficiency levels of 3 and 4 are just indicating the level that the student is able to approach the standards. So if you are at a level 3 or 4, then you are able to read that grade level text at a higher, deeper DOK or depth of knowledge, and have a deeper understanding of complex text. If you're at a score of 1 or a 2, it doesn't mean that you can't read. It just means that you're not able to access the standards at that same level. So if you're looking at being able to identify multiple main ideas and then identify the details that align with those main ideas at a level 3 and 4, you're probably able to do that. At a level 1 or 2, you might only be able to identify one main idea, and you might struggle to identify those details that align with that main idea.
Member Carey?
Thank you, Chair. Just so I know that I'm looking at this right. So for 2023 and 2024, those were the same standards. And so under the 2023-24, most of these grade levels were trending in what I would say is a positive direction. Right? There's some that are, you know, we lost ground on, but mostly they're moving in the right direction. When I look to 2025, for 5, 6, those are significant drops. And what we're saying is that it really isn't a demonstration of a loss of proficiency, but rather it's a new standard. We're measuring different things. Is that correct?
Yes, it is. This new cut scores are really showing more consistency across the grade levels. It is different blueprint. We have different standards. We've removed standards that were previously assessed, and those are no longer assessed. And so it is really just showing what the current standards and what it looks like.
Chair, if I may. So my question is, and it may not be feasible because it's just not feasible. It may not be feasible because of time or money. But in order for this to be apples, apples, and apples, we would need to measure the score with the same assessment. In my limited knowledge. Like that's what I would think. So my question is, I understand in 2025 we're using the new assessment, but is there a reason why we can't have a footnote or at least a line in backup that says, but had we used the same assessment in 2024, this is what the percent proficient score would be in 2025? Does that?
Yeah, I think so. Some of the things we've done in the past, like in our 21 administration, we didn't have an assessment in spring of 2020 because of COVID. So we were anxious to see how students were doing in the spring of 21, and we did include an asterisk to say, remember, like, what was happening in schools the 2021 school year, that lots of students were not in attendance, and we had a little asterisk that noted that on our school report card. And as we were moving forward with any of our reporting, as far as being able to compare how many students were proficient on this assessment, I don't know that we'd be able to do that going backwards because we didn't apply these same blueprints. Students in 2024 didn't take these items, didn't take this test. So we wouldn't be able to like go backwards and say, if they were to take this, this would have been. What we can do is still calculate growth because we don't have to have the same measure to calculate growth. So we're still planning, our timeline is to still include growth on data gateways. So we can still take a look at where students improving or growing with their knowledge from one year to the next. So we can do that and plan to do that. But as far as the percent of students proficient, we can make a note about this is a different assessment and we're assessing new standards. Like I said, we had our other standards for 10 years that we assessed. So we could make a note on the school report cards noting, hey, this is a shift, which is part of why we're talking about the cut scores being on a different scale. So to help people visually see, there are different standards that are being assessed. It wouldn't be exactly the same as the 24 to 2014 standards being assessed.
Yeah.
Because I can see parents and others saying, wow, what happened? And so I just wanted to make sure I better understood that. So thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. And Superintendent Hart has a comment as well before we move to Member Davis.
Yeah, I just always, and this is as much for the public as it is for board members in here. One thing that I always found myself having to remind people is that the groups that take these tests change every year as well. So you're not, we can say, well, third grade scores have dropped, but is that, you have to take it with a grain of salt because they're completely different third graders. They're not the same students over time. So they were, they went through a different experience, and especially now with the effects of the pandemic in there at different milestones. The students that were born a year before the pandemic have different effects than students born 2 years before the pandemic, depending on what their age was at the time that they were not in school for any length of time or not engaging in normal activities or sports or other things. It has affected our children. So you're going to see different effects because you're dealing with completely different cohorts of students. So it really is, I just cringe when we use test scores in different ways, to say our fifth grade scores are declining. Yes, that tells you a tiny piece of information, but those fifth graders are different from, they're a completely different bunch. So not only has our tests changed, but our students changed. It really is a snapshot in time, and we really do need to be very, very careful about how we're using any metric and really make sure that we understand. That's why We're looking currently, I think it was Member Bogus, talking about making sure that when we put something out on the data dashboard, that we are responsible about defining the terms that we're using and talking about the limitations. And quite frankly, it's why I'm concerned about a lot of the data dashboards that have popped up about education, because they're not, data needs to be used in a very responsible and clear way. And it's something I'm excited about how our agency is moving forward, making sure that we are educating on data literacy just as often as we're putting out metrics about our students in our schools. So just wanted to mention that, just because it's just, you've got to take these kinds of metrics with a light touch. They're very complex, and it's very hard to distill and then describe them in just a few words. So thank you for your hard work on this.
Thank you. I've got Member Davis and Member Bogus. I do want to remind board members that we are midway in this presentation. This is okay. We are at questions. Okay, let's keep going then. There it is. Member Davis.
Are we still doing the Aspire literacy, or what are we doing in our, we have another literacy assessment, don't we, besides just the RISE? And does that reflect similar data of proficiency? Because it feels low, the proficiency feels low to me. Can you help?
Yeah. So I think you're wondering about the Acadience assessment.
I'm thinking of
that's
Acadience,
required,
thank you.
In kindergarten through third grade is required. It's optional. We pay for licenses for students in fourth through sixth grade in reading as well. So as far as the Acadience comparison to our RISE comparisons, a year or so ago, there was a conversation about reading on grade level and where do we set those cuts for reading
Yes.
on grade level.
Yes, I remember.
And it was determined to set the cut for reading on grade level between the above benchmark levels, the green and blue levels on Acadians. Those were consistent with what we're seeing on our RISE. So typically, if students are meeting those reading on grade level cuts that were recommended, those were pretty significantly consistent with how students were performing on RISE, whether they were proficient or not. So if a student was meeting that above benchmark level, then they were most likely proficient on our RISE assessment as well.
So you have to be above benchmark to be proficient on this.
Right. And the difference in the communication and conversation that we had at the time was the Acadience benchmark is looking at students' basic early literacy skills, and it's determining whether or not they'd be successful on the next benchmark administration, not necessarily whether or not they were reading the complexities and the depth of content or the depth of the passages and questions that we were getting at on the RISE level assessment.
One more follow-up, Chair.
Follow-up, go ahead.
People want to know how many third graders are reading on grade level. How do we answer that question?
Well, if we go back to what the board has recommended as the reading on grade level cuts, it's the above benchmark level on Acadians is what we've determined, the board has determined as the title of reading on grade
So we've
level.
set our bar higher than a reading on grade level. For us to be able to say they're on grade level, they need to be above grade level. When we have this conversation with Acadians, it's hard to explain this to the public, because then they look at this 44% are proficient. Well, 44% are actually reading above grade level to be able to get to our standard of proficiency. They look at that and think they're doing very poorly.
Yeah, and I think that's the conversation of what do the two different assessments measure, of looking at, are the students meeting a basic level? So if they're meeting benchmark on Acadians, are they meeting that basic level of they're most likely to score well on the next benchmark? On basic literacy skills, are you able to fluently and accurately read text versus are you able to look at a text deeply and understand complex questions, comprehension questions about that text?
Thank you. I've got Member Bogus, then Member Carey.
Sorry, thank you, Chair. So it was stated that different cohorts take this test every year, which is not necessarily true. They just take a different grade level. So if we track the grade level from, for example, percent proficient in 2024, 46.4%, then going into the fourth grade, they trend relatively equally. But if we look at the fourth grade going into fifth grade, they went down. Fifth grade going into sixth grade goes down 7 percentage points, 6 if you count the dot there. But anyhow, so you see a significant drop in every grade level except 3 to 4 and 7 to 8. And so you can trend the data. You can do that. True?
Sydney, go ahead.
You would be able to follow a cohort from like grade 4 to grade 5.
Yeah.
One of the things as we were looking at the outcomes after the educators recommended where these cuts would be, we took a look at what exactly the educators were doing when they recommended these cuts. And a big part of that, as Teresa mentioned, were the proficiency level descriptors. So they looked at all of the items in order of difficulty from the most amount of students getting that item correct to the least amount of students getting that item correct. And then they looked at the proficiency level descriptors, and Chair Bollinger, you asked about how do teachers know like what that means. Those are posted on the utahrise.org website, those proficiency level descriptors, and they lay out every standard that we assess and what a student would know and be able to do as a level 1 aligned to that standard. So that's a nice tool for educators to be able to use. If I'm trying to look at what would my student need to do to be proficient at this standard, and what skills would they need to be able to answer or do on a test question, those tools are available. So as far as we can follow cohorts, yes, but ultimately it came down to not necessarily looking at past data, but the educators taking a look at, on this item, what level of student would be able to answer this question. If a student who would only meet those level 1s knowledge and skills of our proficiency level descriptors, then that would be where that, like, what's the line between where a level 1 student would be able to respond to these questions versus a level 2 student. So the consistent thing is the educators taking a look at those descriptions of what a student would know and be able to do, and that's ultimately where they decided these cuts should be.
Member Carey.
Just a follow-up off of what Board Member Davis was asking. So if we use the Acadians benchmark, and instead of saying this is the benchmark, but we're going to raise the bar here, if we just use the Acadians benchmark, it's my understanding that what you're saying is that our proficiency number would go up. Is that correct? Or oversimplified?
Yeah, so if we just use Acadians, which we only require right now for students in kindergarten through 3rd grade, so we do have an overlap with 3rd grade students taking both Acadians and RISE. But if we set that cut of students who are just meeting that benchmark level, there would be more students meeting that students at benchmark according to the Acadians assessment.
So for the 3rd grade, and I don't know if you have this information or not, and if not, I'll accept an email if that's appropriate to request it. I'd love to know what the proficiency assessment is on Acadians for the 3rd grade. Understanding it's a separate test, but at least then we're using that generic benchmark, right? We're not saying it in order to be proficient, you need to be proficient plus, but rather you hit the proficient score. So do we know how that Acadians proficiency rating or assessment would compare to the 44.67% we're showing here for RISE? Oh, no email necessary.
Chair, if I may. So our 2025 end of the year data shows for our 3rd grade students who met that cut score for reading on grade level was 48.7. That is the line between students who are at benchmark, which means that they are 80% likely to be successful on future reading benchmarks, and the line between above benchmark, which Acadians determines that they are 90% likely to be successful on future benchmarks. And that's the score that most closely aligned with our RISE assessment when the study was conducted last fall.
And I understand you are walking like two tight ropes, right? And at the same time, I'm balancing dishes. So I understand this isn't apples to apples, and I appreciate the latitude, Chair. Thank you.
Thank you. Member Davis?
Do we have access to the numbers right now? You know, we set ours a little bit high at the at or above, but do we have numbers that are just would be the at line, or at least half of these students are going to be scoring well?
Are you asking about RISE, or are you asking about
I'm
Acadians
asking about
now?
Acadians.
We're kind of moving away
and
from,
RISE.
well, RISE is right in front of us, I believe, right? Proficient.
It is. It's just so difficult to explain this to the public that we have set our scores high, and it's especially hard to explain when on our NAEP scores we're performing really well comparatively. So I guess we just continue the narrative that we've just set a really high bar, which is fine, but we just need to know how to explain it to people.
Well, I know we had a long conversation about this. How many? I mean,
We're too long, but can I just get the number?
not here. I'm saying it was before our new board members. Remember we had study sessions
in a long study session.
Yeah, and we had conversations about why are we choosing blue, which is what, 404 plus.
I can get my number offline if you prefer. I just want to know what the number would be if we hadn't have hit that line at or above, if we would have hit just at.
If we would have hit, do you have those off the top of your, not the top of you, but in front of you? Can you respond? Like I said, I don't want to get too far away from RISE, but if you have those available, let's share.
Yes, I do. The cuts, if students who are at and above benchmark in third grade, this end of the year 2025 was 70.5%.
70.5%. Thank you.
For at and above benchmark combined.
So
thank you. Yeah.
And
Follow up.
Just hard to explain that versus this.
It is hard to explain. I can't remember, Sydney, did I send you an email recently saying, explain this to me again? Because my LEA is, you know what I mean? Like I hear you. I'm right there with you. I'm not happy about it either. I'd much rather say, this is what we're getting at, right? So, but we can have that conversation. We can bring all this back and have that. I don't think staff explained it well. We had Darren explaining it to us. Yeah, we can bring that back if we want to, but let's stay focused here. We don't have a motion. There is a motion in backup, but there's nothing on the table. Anything before we move forward with this? Is there anything, Sydney or Teresa, anything else that you'd like to say here? Please.
Yeah, just thank you, Board Member Davis, for bringing up the NAEP scores, because that is some of the data that our educators and that our psychometrician team had on hand to look at what were our previous ELA scores, what does that look like compared to our NAEP scores. So when we looked at our NAEP scores from 2024, fourth grade we had 36% of students proficient, and eighth grade had 31%. So previously with NAEP, Utah's been considered one of the truth-telling states because we have rigorous yet attainable standards for what we expect of our students, and it is aligned with the national standards that they would see on the NAEP assessment, which we typically do well. Our state, Utah, has done well on NAEP the last couple of years. Well, that's relative, but at least better than some other states.
So Sydney, so the proposed motion that has not been made yet, but can I read this to you and you can help us understand, because we're asking questions over here. The proposed motion in backup is that the board approves the recommended proficiency cuts for the RISE ELA grades 3 through 8 assessments. Is that, maybe that's just unclear to me, but can you explain that a little bit? What are we voting on? There you go. Wait, almost. There you go.
Yeah, so the cuts would be, in this case, it would be the percent of students proficient, and then that would apply to which scale that goes on to. So whether that would be like the scale of the 400s or the scale of the 1500s. But what you would be voting on are the recommended, where the committee said we should put those actual cuts and not the actual scale of the cuts.
Vice Chair Wood. Not Vice Chair Wood. Don't worry about responding. Watch your grandchild. Vice Chair Bollinger.
Thank you, Chair. I'd like to make a motion that the board approves the recommended proficiency cuts for the RISE ELA grades 3 through 8 assessments.
Thank you. Do we have a second? I'll second. Okay. Do you want to speak to that? You don't have to. Yeah.
I will waive. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. The motion is before us. It is that the board approves the recommended proficiency cuts for the RISE ELA grades 3 through 8 assessments. Let's vote.
Vice Chair Wood? Vice Chair Wood, are you with us? Okay, we'll go to
Yes.
member. Oh, and your vote?
Yes.
Thank you. Member Reel? Looks like she's stepped out. Member Longacre? Yep. Member Lear?
Yes.
Member Lear is a yes. Member Carey? Member Kelly?
Yes.
Member Kelly is a yes. Member Hall? Member Hall is a yes. Member Green?
Yes.
Thank you. Member Earl? Yes. Member Earl is a yes. Member Davis? No. Member Davis is a no. Member Brinton?
Yes.
Thank you. Member Booth?
Yes.
Okay. Member Bogus? No. Member Bogus is a no. Member Reel? Yes. Member Reel is a yes. Member Longacre? Member Longacre is a yes. Member Carey?
Yes.
Member Carey is a yes. I'm also a yes. Chair Hymas?
Yes.
Chair Hymas is a yes. So that passes with 13 for, 2 against, those being Member Bogus and Member Davis.
Thank you. Thank you, Sydney and Teresa. That finishes agenda item 6. Board members, here's what I'd like to do. If you don't mind, we do have a hard stop at 2 o'clock. There are other things that board members and staff need to get to. There are other meetings today.